Colleen here, DIYer behind LemonThistle.com, and today I am excited to share this DIY macrame stocking with you all. For this video, I've partnered with my friend Alexis, who you might know from my Cricut for Silhouette series with her, but we also macrame. So for this video, we've challenged each other to make some cute macrame holiday decor items, and this stocking is my project. Before we get into it, if you have not yet subscribed to my channel, I would so love if you did that below so you don't miss out on any more DIY or home decor videos. If you are new to macrame, I am going to go through all the different knots that I've used in here, but I have a beginner macrame video that covers the 4 most common macrame knots. I will link that below. It goes through troubleshooting and has like diagrams. It's super easy to follow if you get hung up on any one of them. Alright, the first thing we're going to do is make the plain stocking that we're going to embellish with the macrame. So for this, you're going to need your fabric, you'll want some fabric scissors, a rotary cutter, and a straight edge for cutting your fabric. So lay out your fabric double thick on your cutting mat, and you're going to want to sketch out a stocking-like design. If you have a stocking that you already love the shape of, you can mimic that or trace that on here. Make sure to give the stocking shape that you do cut some seam allowance, so you're going to want to make it 1/2 inch larger on all edges, so about 1 inch wider across than you want your final stocking to be. You're also going to want to make the long skinny part of the stocking taller than it needs to be because you'll want to give it a fold over hem. We are not going to sew it shut before we do our macrame in order to save some sewing time. We're going to do our macrame the size of the stocking, and then we're going to sew it into the edges when we sew the stocking together. So I used a dowel to start off the macrame. I'm just putting this right at the top of the stocking, and I am using my lark's head knot to attach the macrame cords to the dowel. This is one of the most basic macrame knots. You just fold your long string in half, so this is going to be about double your arm span that you're cutting these pieces of macrame cord, and then you loop it over with that fold in the center of the cord and pull the ends through. This is how we're going to start it off. I used 16 of these, so 32 strings total by doing 16 lark's head knots onto your dowel. And I'm going to kind of group them in twos so that I have a total of 4 strings together, and we are going to use those 4 strings to do square knots in each of those sections of 4. A square knot is one of the most basic knots. The middle 2 cords do not move. You take the outside left cord and cross it over like a 4, and then you take the right cord over top of that string, tuck it underneath the middle 2, and pop it out the hole on the other side. You pop it out where that bend is in the 4 shape, and then you do the opposite going the other way. So it's 2 knots to make the square knot. At this point, I found that the dowel was moving around quite a bit, so in an effort to stop this, I am just tying the dowel to the top of my cutting mat here, which will help it stay stationary. You could also do this hanging from a doorknob or something like that, but I really liked the visual of having it on top of the stocking as I was doing my knots, so I could see exactly how much space I was taking up here. Okay, so we are doing square knots all the way across. I am leaving a bit of a gap at the top, and this is so that I can sew this macrame piece into the fold over of the stocking. On a normal macrame piece, I would do these square knots right up at the top by the dowel. The cord that I'm using here is just cotton cord. You can get this on Amazon in bulk rolls from packing stores, or you can get a thicker macrame cord if you like as well. That's just typically more expensive. This is what I've been using for all of my macrame projects. I love the way it looks. It's a natural cotton cord, which gives it a beautiful soft white color instead of a bright white. I'm honestly not sure what fabric I'm using. This was left over from some project somewhere along the way, but yeah, use whatever fabric you like. As long as it's not stretchy, it should be beautiful for this. Okay, the next line of knots is also square knots. We're going to alternate these to create kind of a lattice pattern by taking just 2 of the strings from each of the previous square knots, and we're going to connect those together. So on the outside edge here, we're going to take 2 of those strings and we're going to lay them over the side of the stocking. These will get sewn into the seam here. And I'll show you how I make sure that I made those long enough in just a moment. So we are just alternating square knots with 2 strings from each of the previous square knots. At this point, you can see that I added dowels in the sides. This will be the width of my stocking, and I am using those dowels just to wrap those outside cords around, just to make sure that they are long enough to sew into the seams on the stocking. You could totally pin these to the stocking as well. This was just the easiest, simplest way that I knew how. I have plenty of dowels. If you don't, you could use pins and pin them onto your stocking. And now I'm just going to continue alternating square knots down the stocking here. So I did 4 lines of alternating square knots in this lattice pattern before I started bringing that alternating square knot to a point. So to do this, I skipped the outside edges square knots and I did a line, and then on the next line down, I skipped those outside knots just to bring it down to a point where there's 1 square knot in the middle in the end. No new knots here, nothing fancy, still only square knots. We are just dropping cords to make the pattern narrower until it gets to a point. All right, now we are moving to another knot. This is the double half hitch. We are going to do this to define this pointed shape. And so you take the outside string and hold it on a diagonal, and we are going to use a double half hitch to knot all of the strings until we get to the center. So to do this, let's make sure that we loop our string that is traveling around the dowel so that we have room to stitch it into the seam of the stocking, and then we're just going to start with that double half hitch. A double half hitch is very simple. It's one of the 4 knots in my basic macrame video, which again I'm linking down below. But to do it, you just hold your traveling string taut and you take your tying string underneath that, throw it over, tucking it between the traveling string and your loop string, and you want to do that a second time. That second time that you do it, it locks it in place. So you can do it loosely and then push it up to get the shape right. That's what I do here. I find that that makes it the easiest to get a nice straight line on a diagonal, and it allows me to move quickly. So this is very repetitive. I am just doing 2 half hitches, so that's the double half hitch for each string until I get to the center, and then I'm going to go in the other direction from the outside on the left as well. When I get to a point in the middle, I am going to take those 2 traveling strings and I am just going to knot them together just with a standard knot. All right, at this point, your macrame stocking is starting to take shape. You can totally see the nice point that these double half hitch stitches bring it to. So now we're gonna do another row of them. This is just gonna make it twice as thick, twice as noticeable, give it a little bit more texture. So you take the outside string, which was your first knotted string in the previous row, and you wanna loop it over that dowel to leave room for stitching it into your stocking. And then you just wanna get going with those double half hitches. Do this all the way to the center, and once again, knot those center knots. So now you have 2 rows of double half hitches, nice and tight, leading to a point. Okay, so we're gonna leave an even amount of spacing, and we are going to do another row of double half hitches. Now this space we are just leaving so that we can add fringe after the fact and keep it all connected. So we are just going to leave, it's like 1.5 inches in between the double row of double half hitches and this new row. So just take the next traveling string and loop it around your dowel so that you can leave room to stitch it into the stocking, and then work towards the middle in a point, mimicking the rows above it. All right, now we are going to move back to square knots, and we're going to kind of do the opposite of what we did on top of the point here. So we'll only do a couple square knots, then we'll have to skip that middle one because it goes to a point, and we're going to alternate to make it to a straight line. All right, so this really just takes 3 rows of the square knots to get it back onto a straight line from that point. And then we are going to do a straight across line of double half hitch, just like the one that's going in a diagonal to a point. You take a traveling string, loop it around the dowel to allow room for the stitches to attach it onto the stocking. And then we're going to do the 2 half hitches to make the double half hitch per string, traveling all the way to the center, and then tie those 2 traveling strings together to make it all snug and neat. All right, and then just like before, we're gonna do a second row of those double half hitches just to bulk it up a little bit. All right, so I tied all of those loose ends just in loose knots just to make it easier to work with this piece here. And now I am removing the dowels. So this will leave loose strings. It's easiest to kind of twist the dowel to get it out without pulling the macrame. And I put my hand there just to keep any of the knots from shifting. So this will leave some loose strings that will be easy for us to sew into our stocking. Once those dowels are removed, I'm going to start pinning it in place so that it's ready to be sewn in. I will add the fringe and the tassels after it's sewn in place. So you can see those lark's head knots that attach the top dowel just come right out. They're just looped on the dowel. That gives us plenty of string to work with sewing into our stocking. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to pin the top part of the macrame in, and I'm going to do a rolled hem, which is about 1 inch thick, and I'm going to fold that over just as so and pin it in place. This allows us to attach the macrame to the face of the stocking. I'm also going to pin the macrame to the edge of the stocking, and I'm only doing this to one layer of the fabric. We're going to sew it onto this layer of the fabric before we attach the stocking together. This way we'll be able to hide the seam of the macrame staying in place, and we'll still be able to visually see what we're doing when we're attaching it onto the stocking. So we're just going through and we're pinning all of those cords in place here. And once that's done, we're going to pull out our sewing machine. Let me just clarify that I am not a seamstress by any means here. I know enough sewing to get the job done. So I am just starting by sewing along the top of the stocking to hold that macrame in place. This is the rolled edge on the top of the stocking here. I'm just double checking that all of my macrame cords are stitched right in, which they are. Woohoo! And then I am going to start on the outside edges. I'm not bothering backstitching any of these seams just because we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew them over again when we attach the back of the stocking in place. So as I am sewing the macrame in place, it does take a little bit of fidgeting to get everything to line up, and that's fine. Just take your time doing this here. The whole goal is just to get the macrame on to the face of the stocking so that it all sits beautifully, nice and flat, and then we will sew a nice straight edge when we sew the backing on. We are not sewing around the entire foot of the stocking, we're just sewing the macrame in place. Okay, once that is all in place, you can admire it, look at how beautiful it looks, and then we are going to grab the back of the stocking, the back piece of fabric, and we're gonna line it up, and then we are gonna roll the top down just to match, and we're gonna sew that top rolled hem. Once that is sewed, we are going to sandwich those pieces together, right face together, so we're gonna sandwich the macrame in between the two pieces of fabric, and we are going to sew the outside seam. We're gonna do this by pinning it all together. I'm pinning not only the outside edge, but also the middle, just so nothing shifts around too much. You don't have to do this, but I did go ahead and make myself a dotted line to follow as I was stitching. I just used a marker on this since it will be on the inside of the stocking. For this stitch, I did backstitch at the beginning and at the end just to make it extra secure, as that's the opening of the stocking, which will get the most wear and tear. You're going to want to sew your stitch approximately in the same line that you stitched the macrame on. This will hide the seam and it will make it look like the macrame cords are stitched straight into the sides of the stocking. Once you've sewed all the way around, you can turn it right way and you can see how cute it looks. It is ready for the fringe and the tassels, and then of course to be ironed as well. At this point, you're going to want to trim any of the loose threads just to clean it up a little bit. All right, let's make some tassels. I am using a note card just to wind macrame cord around. I am doing this about the length that I want my tassel. You can make it super chunky, or you can make them kind of small tassels, whatever you choose. So when you feel like it's a good chunkiness, I'm just checking that there with my fingers, then you can cut it off and cut one end of that wound piece of string, and that's going to become your tassel. So what I did here is I unfolded it and I put a piece of string in the middle. This is what I'm going to use to attach it onto our macrame stocking. And then I am also going to use another piece of macrame cord to tie the tassel, the top of the tassel shut. So you're going to do that as many times as you need to make as many tassels as you need. I ended up doing 5. I highly recommend doing an odd number. There's something about odd numbers that just look so much more visually appealing. And you can trim your tassels to make them nice and flat as well. Or at the end, after you tie them on, you can trim all of your cords at the same time. All right, so we've got all of our tassels laid up. Time to make the fringe. So we are adding a fringe to that 1.5 inch gap that we left between the double half hitch rows. So I am just using the same note card. I'm winding it around again, and I am going to cut it just like I did the tassel, except I am going to open it up and I'm going to use each of these individual pieces of cord for my fringe. So there may be better ways to do this. This just seemed like the easiest and it worked beautifully. So I'm going to take each one of those cords here and I am just going to knot it on each one of those individual cords that we have left the gap for fringe. Do this across the whole entire row and then you can trim those to size using some great fabric scissors. Again, I trimmed these in a little bit of an arrow shape, just like the double half hitch lines direct. And then I'm going to push those all up to the top and I'm going to add a second layer of fringe. Now for this second layer, I'm going to make it a bit chunkier. I'm going to use 2 pieces of cord for every knot that I'm tying on. So I'm just knotting 2 on at one time. Once I've gone all the way across with the 2, then I'm going to flip it all down and I'm going to cut the second layer of fringe in that same arrow pattern, just making sure to cover that gap that we left for the fringe. All right, once that fringe is looking cute, it's time to attach the tassels. So I am knotting all 5 of these on to the threads below and I'm using knots in those strings that I'm tying them onto to hold them in place. And then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to trim it all to a pretty even length here. At this point, I loved it, but I wanted to make it look a little bit more professional. So at the bottom where I have those curved hems on the stocking, I just ironed those flat. I'm using my Cricut Easy Press here. Then I'm also ironing the top where I have that rolled hem, and I did iron the fringe in place just to help it all face down like I wanted. Last but not least, I just sewed a ribbon on to the inside of the stocking so that I had a way to hang it. And then you're done and you can hang it up and it is so beautiful and I'm truly in love with this project. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more DIY or home decor videos.